A billionaire spent 4 entire years buying every single company she had ever worked for just to find the woman who vanished after one night with him, and what he uncovered when he finally tracked her down would shatter everything he thought he knew about love loss and the truth she had been hiding. Before we begin the story, let us know in the comments from which city are you watching. Enjoy the story, everyone. Elena Marquez was a quiet woman with tired eyes and a smile she rarely let anyone see. She worked 2 jobs to keep the small apartment she shared with her ailing grandmother afloat, and on that particular Saturday night in late October, she had taken on a 3rd shift as temporary catering staff at a charity gala held inside one of the most expensive hotels in the city. The ballroom was an ocean of gold light, crystal chandeliers, and people whose shoes cost more than her monthly rent. Elena adjusted the black apron over her uniform, took a tray of champagne flutes from the kitchen, and stepped into the buzzing crowd, reminding herself she only needed to make it through 6 hours, and then she could go home and sleep. She had no idea that this single shift was about to fracture her life into 2 halves. The one before that night and the one that would come after. Adrian Castellanos was the keynote guest of the evening, a man of 34, whose name appeared on the cover of every financial magazine that year. He had inherited a modest construction firm from his late father at 22 and turned it into a transcontinental empire that touched logistics, real estate, energy, and shipping. He was tall with dark hair, beginning to gray at the temples, and an expression that always looked slightly bored, as though life had already shown him everything it had to offer. His assistant, a sharp woman named Carla, followed 2 steps behind him as he greeted senators, investors, and a former minister who clearly wanted something from him. Adrian shook every hand, smiled the right amount, and felt absolutely nothing. He had not felt anything in a long time, and somewhere deep inside, he had stopped expecting to. He turned away from a conversation about offshore tax structures to take a flute of champagne from a passing tray, and that was the moment his eyes met Elena's. She was looking down, focused on balancing her tray so she did not see him at first, but he saw her clearly, and something inside his chest that he believed had gone permanently silent suddenly made a small, uncertain sound. Her hair was pulled back into a simple knot. A strand had fallen loose against her cheek and her eyes when she finally glanced up to apologize for nearly bumping into him were the deepest, most exhausted brown he had ever seen. "Sorry, sir," she murmured, stepping aside, but Adrian did not move. He simply looked at her as though trying to remember where he had seen her before, even though he was certain they had never met. Carla cleared her throat behind him and reminded him of the next introduction he was supposed to make, but for the first time in years, Adrian Castellanos ignored his schedule. He asked Elena her name. She hesitated, then answered, "Elena." That was all, just Elena, no last name, no story. He asked her if she enjoyed working these events. She said honestly that she did not, but that the tips were good and her grandmother needed a new prescription. She immediately regretted being so direct with a stranger and started to apologize. But Adrian only smiled, a real smile, the kind that made the corners of his tired eyes soften, and told her that honesty was the rarest currency in a room like this. Elena did not know what to say, so she said nothing. She walked away, tray in hand, and tried to convince herself that the warmth climbing up her neck was just from the heat of the chandeliers. She did not realize that Adrian had not looked away once, and that he had quietly told Carla to find out which agency the catering staff came from. But Elena was used to being invisible. She had been invisible her entire life. Invisible in school, invisible at the diner where she waited tables, invisible in the hospital corridors where she sat with her grandmother. And so she did not understand why this man, this stranger in a perfectly tailored midnight blue suit, kept appearing in her line of sight throughout the evening, always at a respectful distance, always looking somewhere else when she turned her head, but always there around midnight when the orchestra changed tempo and the older guests began drifting Toward the exits, Ilana slipped out a side door to the hotel garden. She only needed a few minutes of air. Her feet were aching, her back was stiff, and she wanted to remember why she had agreed to this shift in the first place. The garden was lit by small lanterns hanging from olive trees, and the night was unusually warm for late October. She leaned against a stone bench, breathed in deeply, and closed her eyes. A quiet voice behind her said, "Long shift." Elena turned and found Adrian standing a few steps away, holding 2 glasses of water. Not champagne water, he offered one to her with an awkwardness that did not match the rest of him. She took it slowly because refusing a guest could cost her the job. They stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the muffled music coming from inside. He finally asked if she always worked this hard. She laughed without humor and told him that working hard was the only thing people like her could afford to be good at. He nodded as though he understood, and she suspected immediately that he did not, but the way he said nothing afterwards, the way he simply stayed there next to her without trying to fill the silence with charm or condescension, made her feel for the first time in years that she was not entirely invisible. They talked for an hour, the kind of conversation strangers can only have once, because the next morning they would be too embarrassed to repeat it. She told him about her grandmother, about the small apartment with the leaking ceiling, about the literature degree she had abandoned in her second year when her mother died. He told her about his father, about the empire he never asked for, about the strange loneliness of a life in which every door opened before he could knock. And somewhere in the middle of that hour, both of them forgot who they were supposed to be. The lanterns above them swayed gently in the autumn breeze, and Elena realized she had not laughed this much in months. Adrian, for his part, could not remember the last time someone had spoken to him without calculating what they might gain from the conversation. She was not trying to impress him. She was not trying to flatter him. She was simply tired, honest, and present, and he found that more intoxicating than any of the imported wines being served inside the ballroom. At some point, a member of the catering staff opened the side door. Looking for Elena, she startled and put down the half-empty glass she had to go. She said quickly, smoothing her apron, and Adrian asked her if she could stay just 5 more minutes. She shook her head and told him she would lose her job, and her grandmother needed the money. He said he understood, but before she could turn away, he asked if he could see her again. Elena froze and looked at him for a long second. She did not know what she saw in his face, but she knew it was not the look of a man who was used to being told no. She also knew exactly what she was supposed to say: a polite refusal, a thank you for the conversation, a goodbye that would protect her from anything she could not afford to feel. Instead, she heard herself say, "One night, Adrian, I cannot promise you anything more than tonight, and if you can accept it, then yes, you can see me again." Adrian looked startled, then almost amused, then very serious. He nodded once and told her he would accept any terms she wanted to set. She finished her shift in a fog, her hands moving automatically as she stacked dishes and folded linens. Her mind was already somewhere else when the gala ended just after 2 in the morning. The other catering girls climbed into the back of the agency van, but Elena told them she had to walk home to clear her head. They were too tired to argue. She walked through the marble lobby of the hotel, and Adrian was waiting by one of the columns. No entourage, no Carla, no driver. He had sent everyone away. He asked her if she still wanted to do this. She said yes, and she meant it for reasons she could not explain to herself. She was tired of being careful. She was tired of being the responsible one. She was tired of being a woman to whom nothing ever happened. Just once she wanted to be someone different. They took the elevator to the top floor where the hotel kept its private suites, and as the doors closed, Elena watched her own reflection in the polished steel and saw a stranger looking back at her, a woman who had said yes. The suite was enormous, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, a small grand piano in the corner, a fireplace that someone had lit before their arrival. Adrian asked if she was hungry. She realized she had not eaten since lunch. He ordered food without asking what she wanted. simply because he knew somehow that she would not be able to choose for herself. They ate sitting on the floor by the fireplace, barefoot-like. Teenagers, she told him stories about her childhood in the small coastal town she had grown up in. He told her about a brother who had died young, and whom no one in the family was allowed to mention. She cried at one point, not because of his story, but because she had not realized how heavy her own silence had become. They kissed slowly, the way people kiss when they know it will only happen once. Adrian touched her face as though he were memorizing it, and Elena let herself for the first time in her entire adult life be held without thinking about what it might cost her later. That night, when she was finally falling asleep with her cheek against his shoulder, he whispered something she did not quite catch. She did not ask him to repeat it. She would later spend years trying to remember exactly what it was. When the sun rose over the river, casting a thin pink line across the suite, Elena opened her eyes and looked at Adrian sleeping beside her, his face younger in sleep than she had imagined, and for one full minute she allowed herself to imagine staying. She imagined what it would be like to wake up next to him every morning, to know what he liked in his coffee, to belong somewhere. Then she remembered who she was, where she came from, and what was waiting for her on the other side of the river. She remembered the unopened envelopes on her kitchen counter. She remembered her grandmother's medication that needed to be refilled in 3 days. She remembered the call she had received 6 weeks earlier from a man whose voice she had hoped she would never hear again. She remembered the photograph in her wallet that Adrian had not yet seen, and she remembered above all the promise she had made to herself when she was 19 years old, that she would never let anyone have power over her again. She slid carefully out of the bed, gathered her clothes from the chair where they had been folded, and dressed in the bathroom. Her hands shaking, she looked at herself in the mirror and made the hardest decision of her adult life. She walked back into the bedroom one more time and stood beside the bed, looking down at him for what felt like a very long time. She did not leave a note. She did not leave a phone number. She did not even leave the small silver bracelet that had fallen from her wrist onto the carpet. She did, however, leave a single thing without realizing it: a folded napkin from the night before, tucked between the pages of a book on the nightstand, a napkin on which she had absently written, and then crossed out, and then written again, the name of the town where she had grown up. Adrian would not notice the napkin until 5 days later. By then Elena would already be gone. She walked out of the suite barefoot, carrying her shoes, and took the service elevator down to the kitchen exit. She did not look back. She did not allow herself to look back. She walked across the bridge as the sun rose, and she did not cry until she was halfway across, when she finally let the tears come. They were quiet, steady tears, not the loud sobbing of regret, but the slow leaking grief of a woman saying goodbye to something she could never have had in the first place. By the time Adrian Castellanos woke up at 9:30 alone, in a suite that still smelled faintly of her shampoo, Elena Marquez had already begun the long, careful disappearance that would consume the next 4 years of his life, and that would test the limits of what a man with infinite money could and could not buy. Adrian sat up in the empty bed, and for the first time in his adult life, he did not know what to do. He reached across to her side of the mattress and felt the cool sheets, and he understood instantly that she had not just gone to the bathroom. He checked the bathroom anyway, then the small kitchenette, then the balcony, then the hallway outside the suite. He stood barefoot in the corridor in a hotel robe and felt absurd. He came back inside and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the carpet. She had walked away on something on the floor, caught his eye: a single silver bracelet, thin and inexpensive, the kind a woman buys for herself at a market. He picked it up and turned it over in his fingers. There were no initials, no engraving, nothing useful, only a small dent on the clasp where it had clearly been broken and repaired with care. He closed his hand around it and felt something he had not felt since his father died a small specific panic, the kind that comes when you understand that something important is slipping through your fingers and there is no protocol, no contract, no acquisition strategy that can stop it. Carla arrived at 10 as scheduled. She had a tablet in one hand and a coffee in the other, and she began reading him his appointments for the day. He interrupted her in the middle of the third item and told her to cancel everything. She looked up, startled. In 5 years of working for him, he had never once canceled a meeting. He told her to find a woman named Elena who had worked catering at last night's gala. That was all. He had her first name and her face. Carla took out her tablet without a word and started typing. The catering agency had a list of 47 temporary workers assigned to the event. Of those, 11 were women between 25 and 30. 5 of those 11, only 3 matched the description he gave. Carla, a small, dark-haired woman with very tired eyes. By noon, she had photos of all 3. Adrian sat in his suite and looked at each photo carefully. He pointed to the second one and said her. Carla wrote down the name on the agency roster: Elena Marquez. Address listed as a small apartment in the eastern district of the city. Age 26. No other information available. Adrian asked Carla to send a car to that address discreetly to make sure Elena was all right, and then to ask her if she would be willing to have lunch with him later that week. He did not want to frighten her. He did not want to push her. He simply needed to know she was safe. Carla nodded and left the suite. She returned 3 hours later with a strange expression on her face. The address on the agency roster did not exist. The building number Elena had given was a vacant lot between 2 warehouses. There was no apartment there, had never been an apartment there. The phone number on her file rang once and then disconnected permanently. The emergency contact listed as a grandmother did not exist either. According to the local registry, Adrian sat back in his chair and felt a cold, quiet realization settle over him. This woman had not simply walked away. She had been prepared to walk away. She had given a false address weeks or months before she had ever met him, because she had been hiding from someone long before he came into the picture. He called the catering agency himself. The manager told him that Elena Marquez had been a reliable worker for almost a year, but that she had called that morning and resigned with no notice. She had told him only that she was leaving the city and had asked him please not to share her information with anyone. Adrian asked if she had ever given a real address. The manager hesitated and finally admitted that none of the freelance staff really did. Adrian thanked him, hung up, and stood at the window of his suite, looking down at the city below. Somewhere in those millions of windows was a woman who had spent one night with him and then erased every trace of her existence so completely that she might as well have never existed at all. He should have let her go. That is what any rational man would have done. It had been one night, one stranger, one momentary lapse. There were thousands of women in the city who would be honored to have dinner with him. There were hundreds of women across the world who had been quietly hoping he would notice them for years. Adrian Castellanos was a man who could rebuild his life around any one of them, and yet he could not stop thinking about the way Elena had said one night and meant it the way no one in his entire life had ever set a limit on him and held to it. The way she had walked away, not because she did not feel something, but because she felt too much. He opened the drawer of the nightstand to put away his watch, and his hand brushed against a book that the hotel had left there for guests. Inside the book, tucked between 2 pages, was a folded paper napkin. He almost missed it. He almost left it for housekeeping. He unfolded it slowly. On the napkin, in handwriting that was rushed and a little uneven, were 3 words written and crossed out and written again. The first 2 were illegible. The third was clear, a single word, the name of a small town he had never heard of, a town called Puerto Halcon. Adrian stared at the napkin for a very long time. He did not know yet that this small piece of paper was the only thread connecting him to Elena Marquez. He did not know yet that he would spend the next 4 years pulling on that thread, one company at a time. He did not know yet that finding her would cost him not just money, but the version of himself he had been. Before he met her, he only knew that the woman who had walked out of his suite that morning had taken something with her that he had not known he possessed, and that until he found her again, he would not be whole. That afternoon he summoned his head of corporate intelligence, a quiet man named Dorian, who had served his father before him. Adrian gave him the napkin, the bracelet, the photograph from the agency file, and the single word Puerto Halcon, and told him to find Elena Marquez. Dorian asked how aggressively he should pursue this. Adrian looked out the window for a long moment and finally said, "Spare no expense, and tell no one why." For the first 6 months, Dorian's team chased Elena Marquez the way they would chase any other person of interest. They ran her name through every public database, every credit registry, every employment record, every tax filing. They got nothing. The woman who had worked catering at the gala had simply ceased to exist on paper. Dorian came back to Adrian after the first month and told him plainly that the woman they were looking for was using a name she had probably borrowed. Elena Marquez was either a person who had died young or a person who had never existed at all. The social security number on her catering paperwork belonged to a child who had drowned in 1994. Adrian listened without interrupting and asked Dorian to keep going. He did not care what her real name was. He only needed to find her. Dorian nodded and changed strategy. If she could not be tracked by her name, she would have to be tracked by her habits. Her habits had been built around survival, and survival meant work. No woman who lived on tips and shifts could vanish without leaving a trail of employers behind her. The trail might be slow, it might be patchy, but it would exist. Dorian assembled a small team and began the long, quiet work of reconstructing Elena's employment history one job at a time. The first lead came in March, 5 months after she had disappeared. A small textile workshop in a town 200 miles south of the city had hired a woman matching her description. For 3 weeks she had given a different name. There, Sara Vega. She had worked the night shift on the cutting floor. She had left abruptly one afternoon without picking up her final paycheck. Dorian flew to the town himself and interviewed the owner of the workshop. The owner remembered her well, quiet, polite, never late, never asked for favors. He had been sorry to lose her. Dorian asked if there was any forwarding address. There was not. He asked if there were any colleagues who might know where she had gone. There were a few, but they had not spoken to her since. When Dorian reported back, Adrian made a decision that he himself did not fully understand. He bought the workshop. He bought it not because it was a good investment. It was barely profitable, and his analysts told him so quite firmly. He bought it because he wanted access to its files, its records, its bank reconciliations, its delivery routes, its supplier contacts, every scrap of paper that might mention Sara Vega. He wanted control over it for as long as he needed it. Carla raised an eyebrow when the acquisition paperwork crossed her desk, but she said nothing. She had worked for Adrian long enough to know when not to ask. The workshop's files yielded a second lead. Elena, under the name Sara, had paid a small advance to a bus company for a ticket to a city 300 miles further south. She had never picked up that ticket, but she had paid for it, which meant for one moment she had intended to go there. Dorian sent 2 of his men to that city to ask quietly at the kinds of places where a woman traveling alone with very little money might find work: bakeries, laundries, diners, hotels, cleaning services. It took them 4 months to find the next thread. A small family-run hotel had employed a woman who matched her description. For 11 weeks she had worked as a housekeeper. She had given the name Marina Soto. She had lived in a tiny room at the back of the hotel. She had been quiet and reliable and had quit one morning without explanation. Adrian bought the hotel 2 weeks later. The staff did not understand why a billionaire from the capital had any interest in their small 34-room family business, but the offer was generous, and the family accepted. Adrian flew down personally for the closing. The lobby smelled of bougainvillea and old wood. He walked through every floor, every storage closet, every staff quarter at the back where Elena had lived. He stood for a long time in the small windowless room she had slept in. For 11 weeks, the bed was narrow, the sheets were thin, the wall above. The headboard had a small water stain shaped like a bird. He sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed his palms against the mattress and tried to imagine what her life had been like in this room and what she had been thinking about during those 11 weeks. Carla watched him from the doorway and felt for the first time a kind of fear she did not know how to name. The man she worked for was changing in ways she had not anticipated. He was not becoming colder, he was not becoming more efficient, he was becoming softer in places he was not supposed to be soft, and harder in places he was not supposed to be hard. The man who had once not blinked at signing a $1 billion contract was now sitting on a housekeeper's bed in a small coastal hotel, as though it were the holiest place he had ever entered. They returned to the capital that night. Adrian did not sleep on the plane. He sat by the window watching the dark country pass below him and tried to understand what he was actually doing. He had a forensic accountant now, whose only job was to flag any new acquisition target that fit the profile he had a private investigator on retainer, whose only job was to follow up on possible sightings. He had 3 lawyers structuring shell companies that allowed him to acquire small, unprofitable businesses without his name appearing in the public records. His board of directors had begun to ask polite questions about the unusual pattern of micro-acquisitions on his personal balance sheet. He had told them only that he was diversifying into small operational testing grounds, and they had accepted the answer because they did not feel they were allowed to ask twice. He was lying to his board, he was lying to himself. The truth was that every business he bought was a paper trail, and every paper trail brought him 1 half step closer to her, and every half step closer to her was a half step further away from the man he had once been. By the end of the first year, he had purchased 9 small businesses across 4 cities. None of them made any economic sense. Individually, together, they formed a strange map of her movements, a constellation of places where Elena Marquez had briefly worked and then disappeared from again. The second year was the year Adrian stopped pretending to himself that this was about anything other than her. In the first year, he had told himself that he was simply curious, that he wanted to confirm she was safe, that once he found her he would step aside and let her go on with her life if that was what she still wanted. In the second year, he stopped telling himself that lie. He wanted to find her, not to release her, but to ask her one single question. Why had she left without a word? Why had she chosen one night and then closed the door so completely behind her that he had to dismantle entire regional economies just to follow her footprints? He was not angry, he was something worse than angry. He was hollow, and he had discovered that hollowness could not be filled by ordinary means. In February of the second year, Dorian brought him a lead from a small accounting firm in a mid-sized inland city. A young bookkeeper had been hired the previous summer. She had stayed for almost 5 months, which was longer than any of her previous jobs she had given. The name Camila Reyes, she had been an unusually gifted employee, and the firm had offered to make her a permanent hire. She had refused without explanation and left on a Friday in October. Adrian was on a plane the next morning. The accounting firm was a small family operation. The owners were 2 brothers in their 60s. They were polite, cautious, and surprised by the offer of acquisition. Adrian sat across from them in a beige conference room with a single window and asked them about the woman who had worked there as Camila Reyes. The older brother smiled gently and said she had been the best employee they had ever had, quick at numbers, careful with clients, always the first to arrive, always the last to leave. She had not asked for raises or promotions. She had simply done her work and gone home. He hesitated, then added that she had seemed afraid of something. The younger brother nodded. He said she had once received a phone call at the office and gone pale. She had stepped outside, and they had watched through the window as she paced back and forth in the parking lot for almost an hour. When she came back inside, she was steady again, but she had quit 2 days later, Adrian asked if either of them had any idea what the phone call had been about. They did not. He asked if they had her old phone number. They did, but it had been disconnected for months. He asked if there was a photograph of her in their files. There was a small employee identification photo. The older brother retrieved it and slid it across the table. Adrian looked at the photograph for a long time. It was unmistakably her. Her hair was shorter, now cut just below her chin. She was thinner. Her eyes were even more tired than they had been the night of the gala. But she was still her. Adrian closed his eyes for 1 second and then opened them and bought the company. By the end of the second year, his portfolio of small acquisitions had grown to 27 businesses, spread across 9 cities and 2 countries. His board of directors had moved past polite questioning and into open concern. His chief financial officer had requested a private meeting with him and asked him directly if he was in some kind of trouble. Adrian had assured him he was not. The chief financial officer had not believed him, but had accepted the assurance because there was nothing else he could do. Meanwhile, Adrian's personal life had quietly collapsed around him. He had stopped attending charity galas. He had stopped accepting dinner invitations. He had stopped seeing the women whom Carla had used to discreetly arrange for him in the years before. That night he had broken 3 engagements his sister had attempted to set up with women from her circle. He had stopped going to his country house. He had stopped riding his horses. He had stopped doing anything that did not serve in some way the long, slow project of finding Elena Marquez. His sister Lucia confronted him over a dinner she had insisted on hosting at her own home. She was the only person in his family with whom he had any real relationship. She sat across from him at her dining table and asked him plainly what was wrong. He did not answer her. She asked again. She told him she had not seen him laugh in nearly 2 years. She told him she was beginning to fear that something inside him had been broken and that he was not telling anyone. Adrian put down his fork and looked at his sister, and for the first time in a long time he tried to tell the truth. He told her about a woman he had met at a gala 2 years ago. He told her about a single night. He told her that the woman had disappeared and that he had spent every resource at his disposal trying to find her. Lucia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question: what will you do when you find her? Adrian did not have an answer. He had not allowed himself to think that far ahead because he had not allowed himself to believe that this search would ever end. Lucia reached across the table and took his hand and told him she was worried, not because he was searching for the woman, but because he had stopped imagining what would happen after he found her. Adrian went home that night and stood on the balcony of his apartment for hours. Looking at the lights of the city, he tried to imagine what he would say to Elena when he finally saw her again. He tried to imagine her face when she opened a door and found him standing there. He tried to imagine what she would do, whether she would slam the door or whether she would take 1 step back and let him in, and he realized with a chill that he could not picture any version of her reaction that involved happiness. She had not run away from him because she had not loved him enough. She had run away from him for some other reason, a reason he still did not understand, a reason that had been chasing her long before they ever met. And somewhere underneath his obsession, he was beginning to fear that finding her might not save her at all, that finding her might in fact be the worst thing that could possibly happen to her. He did not stop searching, but for the first time he understood that the woman at the end of this road might not be the same woman who had walked out of that suite 4 mornings short of her 27th birthday. She would be someone older, more tired, more wounded, a woman who had been running for 3 years already from something he still could not name. The truth about Elena Marquez was simpler and more terrible than Adrian could have guessed. Her real name was not Elena, and it was not Sarah or Marina or Camila. Her real name was Sofia. Aguirre and she had been running from a man named Damian Castro since she was 22 years old. Damian Castro had been her first love, a charming, attentive young man from a wealthy family in her coastal hometown of Puerto Halcon. He had courted her with a patience that had felt like devotion. He had married her in a small church on the cliff overlooking the sea, and the first time he had struck her had been on the evening of their 3-month anniversary. The second time had been 2 weeks later. By the time Sophia was 24, she had learned to read the small signs that preceded each storm: the tightening of his jaw, the slow turning of his ring around his finger, the long silences that meant he was searching inside himself for a reason to be angry. By 25, she had stopped reading the signs because the signs had stopped meaning anything. The violence came, whether she behaved well or badly, whether she stayed quiet or spoke up, whether she existed or tried to disappear inside her own house. She would have probably died in that house if her grandmother had not become ill. Her grandmother lived in the city 600 miles north, and there was no one else to care for her. Sophia had begged Damien for permission to go, and after weeks of refusal, he had finally allowed it. Because he believed that her dependence on him was so total, she would always come back. She had not come back. She had taken her grandmother's small savings. She had bought a one-way bus ticket. She had changed her name 3 times in the first year. She had taken whatever work she could find that paid in cash, that did not require references, that did not appear in any official database. She had cut her hair. She had changed the way she dressed. She had lost 20 pounds, and she had spent every night of those first 18 months waiting for the sound of Damien's car outside the window. When her grandmother had recovered enough to travel, they had moved together across 3 more cities. Sophia had taken a series of catering and cleaning jobs, always paying cash for the rent, always renting from landlords who did not ask questions. She had stopped using her real birthday. She had stopped going to doctors except for emergencies. She had stopped trusting anyone who was kind to her, because kindness in her experience was usually the first warning of something far worse. She had been working catering shifts for almost a year when the gala assignment had come through, and she had taken it because the pay was double and her grandmother needed a new prescription. She had not expected to meet anyone. She had certainly not expected to meet Adrian Castellanos. She had recognized him. She had seen his face on the cover of magazines. In the dentist's waiting room, she had read articles about him while waiting for her grandmother's appointments, and she had thought of him the way she thought of all such men, as someone who belonged to a different species, in a different country, in a different life. And then he had stood in front of her with his slightly bored expression and asked her name, and she had felt something inside her chest that she had assumed Damien had killed forever. It had not been killed, it had only been sleeping, and that frightened her more than anything that had happened to her in years. She had told herself that one night could not hurt her. She had told herself that a man like Adrian would forget her by Sunday. She had told herself that allowing herself one single act of pure selfishness, one single night that belonged only to her, could not possibly undo 3 years of careful, invisible work. She had been wrong. By morning she had understood 3 things. First, she had understood that she could fall in love with this man very quickly if she allowed herself to. Second, she had understood that loving him would require telling him the truth, and telling him the truth meant putting him into the same danger she had been running from. Third, and most importantly, she had understood that she might be pregnant. The third understanding had not come from any test she had performed. It was simply a feeling, a slow certainty that arrived as the sun rose over the river, and she lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to Adrian breathe. She had felt the small shift inside her body that women sometimes feel. Even before science can confirm it, she had known, and she had done what any woman with her history would have done. She had run, she had walked away. That morning, not because she did not want Adrian, but because she did, and because she understood that the man who had broken her was the kind of man who would find them both and ruin everything she had built in order to keep the child she now believed she was carrying. She had taken the train south. She had told her grandmother only that they needed to move. Again, she had not told her grandmother about the night of the gala. She had not told her grandmother about the child. She had not told anyone for almost 3 months, until the small clinic in a town where no one knew her name had confirmed what she had already known. The child was a boy. He had been born in early summer in a small public hospital under a name that was almost but not exactly hers. She had named him Matteo. She had given him no father on the birth certificate she had carried him home in. A borrowed blanket. She had looked at his face for hours and understood that her old life and her new life and her future life were all now organized around protecting this one small person at any cost. Matteo was 3 years and 4 months old by the time Adrian's investigators finally found the trail that led to Porto Halcon. He had his father's dark hair. He had his mother's tired, careful eyes. He had no idea that a stranger in a city he had never visited had been buying companies for 4 years, simply to find his mother. The third year was the year Adrian Castellanos became someone his own employees no longer recognized. He had always been demanding, but he had never been cruel. By the middle of the third year, that distinction was beginning to blur. He fired 3 executives in 1 month for reasons that his board considered insufficient. He doubled the workload of his acquisitions team and demanded results that his analysts privately believed were impossible. He stopped going home to his apartment for days at a time, sleeping instead on the leather sofa in his office where the lights were always on and the city below was always alive. Carla, who had served him for 7 years, began to look at him with something that was not loyalty anymore, but pity. She did not say anything because Adrian Castellanos was not the kind of man who tolerated being pitied. His physical appearance had also changed. His hair had more gray in it than dark. His face had hollowed out at the cheeks. His suits, which had once fit him perfectly, now hung slightly loose from his shoulders. He ate when reminded. He drank coffee when offered. He slept only when his body gave him no other choice. He had become, in a way he himself recognized but could not stop, a man possessed, and yet the search was working slowly, painfully, unmistakably. It was working. Dorian's team had reconstructed almost the entire map of Elena Marquez's movements. They had her in 14 different cities under 9 different names. They had her in jobs ranging from accounting to laundry, from baking to waitressing. They had photographs of her at different weights and with different hairstyles. They had testimony from former employers, former neighbors, former landlords, every one of whom had described her with the same words. She was quiet, she was reliable, she paid her rent on time, and one day she simply did not come back. The only thing they did not have was her current location. Every time they got close to where she had been 3 months earlier. She was always one step ahead of them, as though she could feel them coming. The breakthrough came in the spring of the 4th year, and it came from an unexpected direction. Dorian had assigned one of his junior investigators, a young woman named Paula, to a project that the senior investigators considered hopeless. Paula had been asked to investigate not where Alana had been, but where she might have come from. Alana's accent, according to several employers, had a faint coastal lilt that did not match any of the inland cities where she had worked. Paula had spent 3 months listening to recordings of regional accents from every coastal community within 1,000 miles. She had narrowed it down to a stretch of about 200 kilometers along a sparsely populated coastline. She had then begun cross-referencing local marriage and divorce records from the previous decade, looking for any woman in her early 20s who had disappeared from official records around the time Elena Marquez had appeared in the catering agency files in March of the 4th year Paula found her. There had been a young woman named Sofia Aguirre, born in Porto Halcon, married at 22 to a man named Damian Castro, never officially divorced, declared missing by her husband 3 years and 4 months before the night of the gala. The police report listed her as a runaway with no further investigation. Paula brought the file to Dorian, and Dorian brought it to Adrian. Adrian read the file in his office at 3 in the morning. When he reached the page that listed the husband's name, he stood up and walked to the window and put his forehead against the cold glass. For a long time, Carla found him there. At 6, when she arrived for the day, she did not ask him what had happened. She simply turned on the espresso machine and waited for him to speak. When he finally did, he asked her to find out everything she could about a man named Damian Castro. From Puerto Halcon. Carla did not need to do much research. The information was easy to find. Damian Castro was 37 years old, the only son of a wealthy fishing and shipping family in Puerto Halcon. He ran the family business. He was a member of 2 yacht clubs. He had been arrested twice for assault. Both charges had been dropped. He was rumored to have political connections in the region. He was a man who did not lose things. He was a man who did not forgive losing things. He was the kind of man whose existence made the entire pattern of Alina's flight finally make sense. Adrian sat in his chair and understood, for the first time, the full shape of what he had been pursuing. He had been pursuing a woman who had not run from him. She had run from another man, and somewhere along the way she had crossed paths with Adrian and had to add him to the list of dangers she could not afford. He should have felt relieved. He did not. He felt instead a slow rising fury that had no shape and no target. It was the fury of a man who has just realized that the world he lives in is significantly worse than the world he had assumed he lived in, and that there is nothing his money can do about most of it. He called Dorian into his office that morning and gave him 3 new instructions. First, under no circumstances was Dorian's team to approach Sofia Aguirre directly. Second, every single piece of evidence they had collected about her movements, every photograph, every employment record, every interview transcript was to be sealed and stored in a private vault that not even Adrian himself could access without 2 separate authorizations. Third, Damian Castro was to be investigated with the same intensity and discretion that had been used on Sofia. Adrian wanted to know everything about him, his business, his finances, his properties, his weaknesses, his enemies, his political protections, everything. Dorian took the instructions without question and left the office. Adrian stood at his window and looked at the sky and understood that his search had just transformed into something different. He was no longer simply trying to find Sofia. He was preparing the conditions under which finding her would not destroy her. The next several months were the strangest of his adult life. He continued his acquisitions, but the targets shifted. He stopped buying the small businesses where Sofia had worked. He began, instead, acquiring strategic stakes in shipping companies, fishing licenses, regional ports, and political consulting firms across the entire coastal region where Damian Castro operated. By the end of the 3rd quarter of the 4th year, Adrian Castellanos had quietly accumulated more leverage over the economy of that coastline than any single individual in its history. He did not yet know what he would do with that leverage. He only knew that when the time came, he wanted to be holding every card, and he wanted Damian Castro to be holding none. And somewhere in a small bakery in a town that he had not yet visited, a woman who still called herself by a borrowed name was kneading dough at 4 a.m. while her son slept in a room behind the kitchen, and neither of them had any idea that the long invisible thread between her and a man she had spent 4 years trying to forget was about to pull tight. Sofia had built a quiet life in the town of Las Brisas. It was a small fishing village 300 kilometers north of Puerto Halcon, close enough to the coast to feel like home, far enough to be a different country in every way that mattered. The streets were narrow and white, the houses were low and pastel. The people minded their own business, which was the single most important quality she had been looking for. She had arrived in Las Brisas almost 2 years earlier, with her grandmother and her son, and a suitcase containing everything they owned. She had used the last of her savings to put down 3 months of rent on a small storefront on a side street near the harbor. She had painted the walls herself. She had bought a second-hand oven. She had taught herself to bake from a book she had found in the public library and from videos she watched late at night on a borrowed laptop. And she had opened a small bakery she called La Aurora because she only baked in the hours before sunrise, and because sunrise was the only part of the day that still felt to her like a promise. Her grandmother, who had grown frailer but sharper in mind, helped her in the early hours kneading and shaping while Sofia ran the front of the shop. Mateo, who was now almost 4 sat on a stool in the corner with a small notebook and a set of crayons drawing pictures of fish and boats and the moon that he insisted came to visit him at night. The bakery was not making them rich, but it was making them enough to pay the rent, enough to buy groceries, enough to put a little aside in a coffee tin under the floorboard for emergencies, enough to feel for the first time in 4 years that her son was growing up in a place where the front door did not need 3 different locks. Sophia woke every morning at 3:30. She went to bed every night at 9. She did not date. She did not go out. She did not even allow herself the small luxury of friendship. She was polite to her customers. She was warm to her neighbors. She was careful with everyone. She had stopped looking over her shoulder every time a car passed, because looking over her shoulder had become so automatic that it no longer required her conscious attention. She still flinched when men spoke too loudly. She still slept with a small kitchen knife on the table beside her bed. She still kept a small bag packed under that same bed containing cash documents and a change of clothes for herself and Matteo just in case, but the constant, suffocating fear of the first 3 years had begun to thin into something almost manageable. Matteo had begun to ask questions about his father. Sophia had been preparing for this for a long time. She had decided that when the questions came, she would tell him only the truth she could afford to tell. She told him that his father had been a good man whom she had only known for a very short time. She told him that his father lived very far away and did not know that Matteo existed. She told him that this was not because his father did not love him, but because she had needed to keep them both safe from another man. Matteo accepted these answers with the calm seriousness of a child who has been taken seriously by the only person in his world. He asked if she would ever meet the good man again. She told him she did not know. He asked if the good man would like him. She told him without hesitation that the good man would love him. The truthfulness of that answer surprised her. She had not allowed herself to think about Adrian for almost 2 years, not consciously, not directly, but his face came back to her unexpectedly sometimes when she looked at her son. The shape of Matteo's jaw, the slight crease that appeared between his eyebrows when he concentrated on a drawing, the seriousness in his face when he was listening carefully. These were not her features, they were Adrian's, and every time she saw them she had a small private moment of guilt and longing that she did not allow herself to examine. She had told herself many times during those 4 years that she had done the right thing. She had told herself that Adrian had probably moved on within weeks. She had told herself that a man like that would have forgotten her face by the end of the month and replaced her with a more suitable woman. Before the season changed, she had told herself that she had spared him a complication and that he should be grateful. She had told herself all these things, and most days she had believed them. In the spring of what would later be called by both of them the 4th year, a stranger appeared in Las Brisas. He was not Adrian. He was a tall man in his 50s in a plain dark suit who walked through the village for 2 days, asking general questions about the local economy. He visited the small port. He visited the fishing cooperative. He visited the town hall. He ate at the only restaurant on the harbor and tipped generously. He did not visit the bakery. He did not ask about Sophia. He did not ask about Matteo. He simply observed and listened, and on the morning of the 3rd day he left and did not come back. Sophia would not learn until much later that the man in the plain dark suit was Dorian, and that he had come not to find her but to make certain that she was safe. She had not been the only person watching. She had not realized she was being watched. She had only felt the strange weather of a place where something had subtly shifted and not been able to name it. 3 weeks after Dorian's visit, a second stranger appeared. This one was different. He was a younger man with sharp eyes and a thin smile. He wore an expensive watch and asked questions in an accent that was unmistakably from the coast around Puerto Halcon. He sat in the bakery on a Tuesday morning, ordered a coffee that he did not drink, and looked at Sophia with a careful, unbroken attention that made her hands cold. He asked her if she had been in town long. He asked her if she had family in the region. He asked her if her name was really Marina, because he had a friend who was looking for someone who looked very much like her. Sophia smiled, the practiced, empty smile she had perfected over 4 years. She told him she had been born in this town. She told him her name was indeed Marina. She told him that she did not know the woman he was looking for. She charged him for the coffee he did not drink. She watched him through the window as he walked back to a black car parked across the street. She watched him take out a phone and make a call. She watched the car drive slowly out of town. She closed the bakery early that day for the first time in 18 months. She went home with Matteo. She pulled the small bag from under her bed. She counted the cash in the coffee tin. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at her grandmother and her son, and she understood with a terrible cold certainty that the 4 quiet years were over. Damien had found her, or someone working for him had, and the question now was not whether she would have to run again, but whether she would be able to run quickly enough. That night Sophia did not sleep. She sat in the small kitchen with the lights off, the kitchen knife on the table within reach, and listened to every sound. The village made the distant water against the pier, the slow movement of a cat across a tin roof, the soft uneven breathing of her grandmother in the next room, the deeper, steadier breathing of Matteo in his small bed near the window. She tried to think clearly. She tried to plan. She had a little cash. She had documents. She had a contact in a town further north, a woman she had worked with briefly 2 years earlier, who had once told her that if she ever needed a place, she could come and stay, no questions asked. She counted the hours until sunrise. She tried to decide whether to leave that very night or whether to wait until morning when buses ran. When leaving would look less suspicious to anyone watching, she decided to wait until 5. She would close the bakery permanently. She would tell her landlord they had a family emergency. She would put her grandmother and her son on the first bus north. She would leave behind everything that could not fit in 2 suitcases. At 4 in the morning, she put on a sweater and went out into the back courtyard to breathe. The air was cool and salty. The sky was a deep blue that was beginning at the edges to turn gray. She stood there with her hands in her pockets and tried to feel something other than the slow, dull terror that had been her constant companion for 4 years. A car pulled into the narrow street outside the bakery. She heard it before she saw it. She stepped back into the shadow of the doorway. She watched a man get out of the passenger side. It was not the man with the sharp eyes from the morning before. It was not Damien. Her heart was so loud she could not hear her own thoughts. The man was tall. He was wearing a dark coat. His hair had more gray in it than she remembered. His face was thinner. He turned slowly, looking at the street, looking at the painted sign for La Aurora, looking at the small flower pot on her windowsill, and finally looking up and seeing her standing in the doorway in the gray early light. Adrian did not move. He had imagined this moment for 4 years. He had imagined 1,000 versions of it. He had imagined her angry. He had imagined her afraid. He had imagined her running away. He had imagined her not recognizing him at all. What he had not imagined was the look on her face now, which was not anger or fear or surprise. It was a strange, exhausted relief. Sophia stood very still in the doorway and looked at this man she had spent 4 years trying not to remember, and felt all of her carefully constructed defenses crack quietly down the middle. She did not say his name. He did not say hers. They stood there in the cold blue hour before dawn, separated by the width of a narrow street, and looked at each other for what felt like a very long time. Finally, Adrian took one slow step forward, not enough to threaten, just enough to indicate that he had not come here to leave again until she told him to. He held up his hands, palms open, the way a man approaches a frightened animal. Please, he said, his voice rough from disuse. I am not him. I am not who you are running from. Sophia found her own voice from somewhere very far away, and she said, how did you find me? He answered very simply, I never stopped looking. She stepped out of the doorway into the street. She did not invite him inside. She did not know yet what she was going to do. She only knew that she could not have this conversation where her son might wake up and hear it. They walked together down the narrow street to the small stone bench at the edge of the harbor where she sometimes sat alone to watch the sun rise. The village was still asleep. The boats were still tied to the pier. The sky was beginning to turn pink. At the edges of the world, they sat on the bench at opposite ends, and Adrian told her quietly, without any rehearsed speeches, everything that had happened over the past 4 years. He told her about the napkin he had found in the suite. He told her about Dorian. He told her about the workshop and the hotel and the accounting firm and all the small businesses he had bought one after the other. He told her about the moment he had finally understood that the person she was running from was not him. He told her about Damien Castro, about the file Paula had brought to Dorian, about the leverage he had been quietly building for the past several months across the entire coastal region. He told her that the man with the sharp eyes who had come into her bakery had not been working for Damien directly, but for one of Damien's cousins who had been hired to find her. Several months earlier, on a quiet retainer, he told her that this cousin had been arrested 2 hours ago in a different town on charges entirely unrelated to her and would not be coming back for a long time. He told her that Damien's company had been quietly cornered for 90 days by a consortium of investors, none of whom Damien could identify by name, and that within the next 2 weeks, Damien was going to be facing a financial collapse that he would not survive. He told her also, without dramatizing it, that he had not done any of this to manipulate her. He had done it because he had understood when he learned the truth that finding her, without first removing the man who had hurt her, would be a kind of cruelty he was not willing to commit. Sophia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she did not speak for a long time. The sun was rising, now turning the sky orange and gold above the water. Finally, she asked him very softly why he had not given up after the first year, or the second or the third. He turned and looked at her for the first time. Directly, his eyes were tired and clear, and he told her the truth. He said, because the night he met her was the first night in his entire adult life that he had remembered what it felt like to be a person, and not just a name on a magazine cover. He said he had not been able to go back to being only a name. He had tried, and he had not been able to. He said he had not been searching for her to claim her. He had been searching for her because he did not know how to be the man he had been before her again, and he had hoped that finding her would tell him whether that man was someone worth being or not. Sophia turned away from him so that he would not see her face. She watched the boats in the harbor and the slow movement of the water. She breathed in salt and bread and the faint smoke of someone's wood fire, and she understood that she had been carrying a secret of her own for 4 years, and that the moment had come to give it to him. She did not know how he would react. She did not know if he would be angry or terrified or simply walk away. She did not know if telling him would ruin the small fragile thing that had just appeared between them on the bench. She only knew that she had run out of reasons to keep it any longer. She turned back to face him. She took a slow, steady breath. She said, Adrian, there is something you do not know about that night, yet there is something you do not know that has been the reason for everything I have done in the last 4 years. Adrian had spent so much of the past 4 years preparing for what he would say to her that he had not prepared at all for what she might say to him. He sat very still on the stone bench and waited. Sophia looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap, small, reddened from years of flour and hot ovens and water. She did not look at him. She could not look at him while she said what she was about to say. She told him that she had known the moment she walked out of the hotel suite that night that she might be pregnant. She told him she had not been able to confirm it for weeks, but that she had felt the certainty of it in a way she could not explain even to herself. She told him that this had been the deepest reason she had run that morning, more than the fear of being found by Damien, more than the conviction that one night was all she could afford. It had been the impossible problem of carrying a child whose father did not know he existed and whose existence would put her and that child and that father all into the path of a man who had spent 2 years trying to destroy her. She told him about the long bus south. She told him about the cheap clinic where the test had been confirmed. She told him about the early summer night in a public hospital when their son had been born. She told him that she had named him Matteo, and that he was 3 years and 4 months old, and that he was sleeping in a small bed in a small room behind the bakery, less than 200 meters from where they were now sitting. Adrian did not move for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. He asked her one question only. "Does he look like me?" Sophia smiled, in spite of herself, a tired, heartbroken smile. She said, "Yes, Adrian, he looks like you." Adrian put his face in his hands. He did not weep. He simply sat there with his palms pressed against his eyes, as though trying to hold himself inside himself. Sophia did not touch him. She did not know yet if she had the right. She waited. The sun rose fully over the harbor, and the first fishermen began to walk down the pier to their boats. No one paid them any attention. They were just two strangers sitting on a bench in the early light. When Adrian finally lowered his hands, his face was completely changed. It was not angry. It was not even shocked anymore. It was something both younger and older at the same time. It was the face of a man who has just been told that a door he believed had been locked forever is in fact open. He did not ask her why. She had not told him. He understood already. He asked her instead if he could meet his son. Sophia looked at him for a long moment and saw all the things she had been afraid of seeing: his money, his power, his ability to take from her the one person who had kept her alive for 4 years. She also saw all the things she had not allowed herself to hope for: the steadiness, the patience, the unmistakable fact that this man had spent 4 years of his life building a quiet, protective wall around her, without ever once demanding that she love him for it. She nodded once and stood up and led him back through the narrow streets to the small bakery. They walked in silence. She unlocked the front door. She led him through the dim shop into the small kitchen and through a low doorway into the back room where her son was sleeping. Matteo was curled on his side under a blue blanket. His dark hair was tangled across his forehead. His small hand was tucked under his cheek. Adrian stopped in the doorway and looked at the child who had been the secret center of his entire life for 4 years without his knowing it. His eyes filled, but he did not allow himself to cry. He did not want the first time his son saw him to be the face of a weeping stranger. He stood in the doorway for almost a full minute, and then he turned to Sophia and asked her in a whisper what she wanted him to do. Sophia looked at him and understood that this was the question that mattered most. This was the moment at which everything would be decided. He was not telling her what was going to happen now. He was asking her. She said quietly that she did not know yet. She said she would need time. She said that for 4 years she had been the only person making decisions about Matteo, and that she did not yet know how to share those decisions with anyone. She said she was not going to disappear again. She promised him that. She promised herself that she would not run from this. Adrian nodded gravely. He told her that he understood. He told her that he was not going to demand anything from her or from Matteo. He told her that he would stay nearby in the town for as long as she wanted him to, and that he would leave the moment she asked him to, and that whatever shape their lives took from this morning onward would be a shape she helped to choose. He told her that he had spent 4 years buying companies in order to find her, and that he was now finally finished buying things he wanted to learn how to give instead. They walked back into the front of the bakery. Sophia made coffee. Her hands were steadier than she expected. She gave him a cup. He sat at the small wooden table where he had never been before, but where it suddenly seemed as though he had been sitting his entire life. Her grandmother woke at 6 and walked slowly into the kitchen. She looked at Adrian without surprise, as though she had been expecting him. For a long time she nodded at him once, and at her granddaughter once, and went to begin the morning's bread without saying a word. Matteo woke at 7. He padded into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, carrying the small notebook he slept with. He stopped when he saw the stranger at the table. He looked up at his mother for instructions. Sophia knelt down beside him and brushed the hair out of his face. She told him in a soft voice that This man was a friend of hers from a long time ago, and that he had come to visit because he had wanted to meet Matteo. Matteo looked at Adrian very seriously. The way he looked at everything that mattered Adrian did not move. He did not try to charm the child. He simply met the small, careful gaze with one of his own and waited. Matteo studied him for a long moment and finally walked over to the table and showed Adrian his notebook. He pointed at a drawing of a fish wearing a hat. He told Adrian very gravely that the fish was a captain and that he had a boat, and that the boat was looking for his mother because his mother had been lost. Adrian's eyes filled again, but he kept his voice steady. He asked Matteo if the captain had found his mother yet. Matteo considered this for a long moment, then said yes. He found her this morning. Sophia turned away to the sink. So that no one would see her face, she pressed her hands against the cold metal and breathed in slowly, and felt for the first time in 4 years the strange, forgotten weight of hope. Adrian stayed in Las Brisas for 37 days. He did not stay in their small apartment he rented. A quiet room in a guest house 2 streets away from the bakery he came in. The mornings before the shop opened to help carry sacks of flour he came. In the afternoons after school, to take Matteo for slow walks along the harbor. He never raised his voice. He never gave gifts that were too expensive. He never tried to be anyone other than the man Sophia had remembered from one night 4 years ago, older and more tired, but still the same in the ways that mattered most. Slowly, day by day, quietly almost, without anyone noticing, the shape of 3 lives began to rearrange itself around a center that had finally stopped moving. On the 40th day, Sophia closed the bakery early one Saturday and asked Adrian to walk with her up to the cliff above the harbor, the same kind of cliff where she had once been married to a man whose name she no longer let herself speak. The sea was a deep blue below them. Gulls turned slowly above the water. Matteo was at home with his great-grandmother working on a new drawing. Sophia stood with her arms folded and told Adrian what she had been thinking. She said she did not want to leave Las Brisas. She had built something here. She had built a life from nothing, and she was not going to let go of it. She said she did not want to live in his world of glass towers and private planes. She had spent 4 years learning how small and quiet a life could be, and how full. She said that if he wanted to be in their lives, he would have to learn how to be small and quiet too, at least sometimes. Adrian listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he told her that small and quiet sounded like the only kind of life he had ever actually wanted. He told her he was prepared to keep his office in the capital and to fly back as little as the business required, and that he had already begun reorganizing the company so that the daily operations did not depend on his presence. He told her that he had bought a small house at the far end of the village 3 weeks ago, and that it had 3 bedrooms, a small garden, and a view of the same harbor. He asked her if she would consider letting him live in it. He asked nothing else of her, not yet. Sophia laughed for the first time in years, a real laugh that surprised them both. She told him he had a very specific way of asking for permission. Damian Castro lost his company in the summer of that year. He never understood why. He never identified the consortium that had quietly bought up his debts. He never identified the political contacts that had quietly withdrawn their protection. He never connected any of it to a single tall man in a dark coat in a faraway capital. He was forced to sell almost everything he owned to cover his obligations, and a year later he moved to a different country, and the small coastal world that had once feared him forgot him with the speed and thoroughness of a wave erasing a footprint. Sophia did not celebrate. She only allowed herself one quiet evening in which she sat alone on the cliff at sunset and let herself feel for the first time in years the absence of a fear that had been her constant companion since she was 22 years old. When she walked back down to the village that night, she looked at the lights of the bakery and her own kitchen and Adrian's small house at the end of the street, and she understood that she had not been saved by him. She had saved herself. She had walked across a bridge at sunrise 4 years ago. And built a life from absolutely nothing, and the man who was now waiting at the door of his house to wave at her as she passed had not rescued her from anything. He had simply waited until she had finished rescuing herself, and then he had walked the last few steps. With her, Matteo learned to call him Papa slowly, and on his own schedule. No one rushed him. He was 4 and half. By the time the word came naturally, Adrian wept the first time he heard it, standing in the doorway of his own house, with his hand on the doorframe, and Matteo halfway up the path, and Sophia watching from the corner of the street, pretending not to see his tears. Sophia did not marry Adrian. She had been married once, and the word still had sharp edges for her. Adrian did not ask. He understood without being told that the legal forms did not matter to either of them, that what mattered was that they had chosen each other in the quietest, most ordinary way. Every morning, for the rest of their lives, the bakery stayed open. Sophia hired a young woman from the next town to help her. In the early hours, she stopped baking at 4 in the morning and started baking at 5. She allowed herself the small revolutionary luxury of an extra hour of sleep. Adrian learned to make coffee. He learned which flour was for bread and which was for pastries. He learned the names of every regular customer. He learned to play the piano badly on a small upright instrument they bought secondhand in the next town and put in the corner of his living room. He taught Matteo to swim. He taught Matteo to read. He taught Matteo to ride the second-hand bicycle they restored together over the long winter. The small businesses Adrian had purchased across the years were never sold. He kept every one of them, not as monuments to his obsession, but as quiet promises to himself. He visited them once each year and met the workers in person and made certain they were being run well by the local managers he had appointed. 9 of those businesses were converted into something he called the Aurora Foundation, a quiet network of safe houses and small employers that hired women who had needed to disappear from their previous lives and who needed a new beginning in a new town under a new name, with a paycheck that did not appear in any database, and a landlord who did not ask questions. He did not put his name on any of it. Sophia ran the foundation from the small back office of her bakery, and over the following years, hundreds of women passed quietly through it. None of them ever knew who had paid for the rooms they slept in or the salaries they earned. They only knew that someone had been there before them and had left a door open. Adrian Castellanos lived another 37 years. He died at 72 in the small house at the end of the village with Sophia beside him and Matteo, who was by then a young man with his own family in the doorway. He did not die a famous man. He did not die a powerful man. He died a quiet man who had once spent 4 years buying every company a single mother had worked for, and who had discovered at the end of that long, invisible search that what he had been looking for had never been a woman. He had been looking for a way to be a person, and she had been looking for a way to be safe, and the two of them had found those things together in a small village by the sea, where the bread was good and the sunrise was always a promise. If this story touched your heart in any way, let us know in the comments below where you are watching from, and share it with someone who needs to remember that even after years of running and years of searching, the right kind of love does not arrive to take anything from you. It arrives quietly, waits patiently, and stays as long as you want it to, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do with all the money in the world is to spend 4 years using it to remove every obstacle between a woman and her own freedom, and then to ask her gently, and only once if she would like him to stay. Thank you for listening until the end, and we will see you in the next story.